Ja, das bin ich, der Hauptmann.
Well, this story I came across about 12 years ago, so I've been wanting to make this film for a very long time, and just the ability to make the film was very satisfying. So I wrote the first draft Christmas vacation before shooting R.I.P.D. So that's how far back it goes. In terms of production, I don't see that many differences between doing an expensive film or a more modestly budgeted film, or even a tiny budgeted film, which I've also done. Because I never feel I have enough days, I never feel I have enough money, I never feel I have enough resources. Because of course as the budget grows, then the expectations grow. But yeah, it was predictably satisfying to not be working within a context where there are many voices involved in making the decisions, where you ultimately create a product that has to sell and make a profit. Our decision-making process was more guided by the question of how to best tell this story. And we knew we would make a confrontational film, a provocative film. So trying to soft code it didn't seem to make a lot of sense. I think that actually would have backfired, which is not to say that the film does not have a desire to entertain. That was very important to me, and it's interesting because that seems to confuse a lot of people. How how a movie about that subject matter also seems to actually have a pulse and a certain entertaining quality. But that was very important to me. It was very hard, and we had a lot of people who opposed us, and especially in some of the governmental funding agencies, in the television committees, there were many people who felt the film was amoral, which I can't quite follow. Because I think the film is many things, but I don't believe we've made an amoral film. I think that the film breaks certain conventions that people are used to, that sort of have calcified into truths in German filmmaking. Yet there's always a good Nazi. We don't have that. There's always sort of a voice of reason somewhere who you can identify with. We don't have that. The film intentionally comes without a manual, a moral manual. It wants you to come to your own conclusions. However, in the form, and this is why the film has a heightened form, in the form is where I get to express my point of view. So there's no verbalizing of the proper moral stance, but I think it's built in the farcical and in the grotesque, how I perceive these characters and what I perceive to be amoral. We didn't actually depart too much from the true story. What's interesting, though, is that, for example, we only know from Herold directly how he found the uniform. And of course, Herold is an utterly unreliable narrator. So he might have come upon this uniform in an entirely different way. We don't know. But for the purposes of the narrative, we did base the story on what he told the court. It's based on court transcripts. I went to the State Archive in Oldenburg, which is where he was tried by a British military court, and he was of course condemned to death, and he lost his head. The German penal system still used the guillotine at the time, and a lot of the dialogue actually is taken directly from those court transcripts. And part of the file at the Oldenburg State Archive contains diaries and letters from people who survived or were present at that camp when Herold was there, and they also have provided us with descriptions. So we did contract some of the characters, of course. I think that's kind of par for the course when you when you're telling a historical narrative. But by and large, it all adheres to how it happened. Now, we did. You know, I came to the story of this character asking the obvious question, why did he do what he was doing? And I tried very hard to answer that question for me, and I realized after a while it was the wrong question to ask, because there really is no answer to it. And explaining, being facetious now, away, you know, why he did it, categorizing him possibly as a psychopath, sociopath, whatever, I think would have taken away from the idea that we want the audience to ask themselves, what would I have done? Because again, it would have been a mouse hole. Again, it would have been a way to distance yourself from this person. So we made the conscious choice to psychologically leave a void, if you will, to leave a white area within Herold that forces the audience to ask themselves, well, what is it really that drives him? Everybody else is clearly explained in psychological terms, but with him, we took that back, and I think that's the biggest deviation from the real story, because I believe in the real story, the real Willi Herold experienced and saw all of this like a cowboys and Indians game with real ammunition. I don't think he was a sadist, so we didn't deviate from that. I don't think he experienced pleasure from inflicting pain onto others. I think it was all a big game to him. I mean, what's interesting is once you don a uniform to ask, what does it allow you to do? You know, how much do you, what you were just saying, allow yourself to explore a part that without the uniform you may not have been able to explore, or any kind of disguise, by the way. You know, you might be able to don a disguise and for the time being, while you wear it, really make yourself believe you're experiencing a different existence, right? So disguises are interesting in that way. As far as this specific disguise is concerned, what I personally find the most interesting is that a lot of people along the way recognize that it's a disguise, and they decide to still pretend that it's real because they benefit from it. So the film also deals, of course, with a certain structure and a certain systemic issue that is built into the National Socialist structure, where as long as you can rely on someone else's responsibility, you're sort of free to do what you want to do, and as long as you adhere to fake rules that they all adhered to rules, but they were really just euphemisms, so they would get around to calling the thing by its real name, which is murdering. So the whole system and its uniforms, sort of the macro and the micro, all work in the same way to liberate a sort of libidinous desire. And that's another thing that I miss in a lot of films that deal with war. It's the libido. I mean, it's a big component of what happens. And when you research daily camp life, you know, there is a bordello component, literally and figuratively, where people are invited to explore their desires. And that's why I think, for example, Salo by Pasolini is still, to me, the best film about fascism, because it made me understand a lot of things that I couldn't have gotten from historical books. And that, I think, and I've only seen it once. I always wanted to see it again. I'm not sure I have it in me, a second viewing. The film is also, of course, branded into my brain, so I can recall it at will, sadly. But I think that's the strength of cinema as opposed to a historical treatment, to thrust you into a narrative in a way that makes it experiential and not safe. and making a non-safe film was our goal, and to make a film, we didn't want to make a tasteful film about something so distasteful either. You know, that's, I don't much like my films on fascism and contemplative. It's also, as so much else in the film, a play with conventions. The convention is that when we as an audience member see someone running, being chased, running for their lives, we immediately side with them. It's the most curious thing. We know nothing about this character. He or she might be a pedophile, a wife beater, whatever, the most heinous person on the planet. We will still side with him or her. And that convention I find interesting. And you know, so I don't actually see it as a manipulation of the audience to enter the film in that way. I see it as a kind of a subversion of the convention. And yes, you're right, there are, you know, there's a synthesis at the end of the film. There's the thesis of of whoever he is as a person, and there's the antithesis of who he is as the officer, which is a different entity, but it still of course has elements of the thesis. But then over the period of time, all of this kind of congeals in a very not good way into the synthesis. And the synthesis, I think, is a almost pubescent, libidinal, you know, wave of, let's see how far I can push this. This is a narrative about what happens when no one says no, and when everybody colludes, and when everybody when everybody steps back because they get whatever it is that they want out of it. And you know, everybody gets their bacon, so they go and let it happen. And he is really, he becomes, you know, the impersonation of that libidinal, ungoverned child.
And despite all this, it sounds like a very grim, violent scenario, which it is. But for me, at least, there's a strong sort of dark comic streak through this film, for sure, from top to bottom. Like, how do you see the absurd and sort of comedy playing into this masquerade and horror?
I think the highest art of humor is to demask authority and to ridicule authority. I've never been a big fan of any kind of authority, and to reveal the pettiness, you know, behind a lot of the authority that we're faced with. And it's very hard for me to not have a farcical look or comedic look at these characters who take themselves so seriously and who are at the same time so small-minded and so petty and stupid, really. And of course that translates also into the imagery. For example, we have one character who is killed at the end during an air raid, and I ask myself, I have to figure out a way to get him killed in a way that is utterly free of any pathos. It has to be a death that is as ridiculous as this character is to me. And so he gets hit by a bomb and literally explodes, and generally when I'm seeing screenings of the film, you know, there's laughter as a result. And it's also, you know, a freeing thing, and it feels good that this guy finally gets what he deserves. But it's an attempt to, again, in a movie that comes without a moral manual, introduce a strong point of view. And the heightening of the tone allows me to express my point of view. And, you know, and I love, I find it very hard to take seriously two men who have a dispute over killing or not killing prisoners, but without any moral category involved, without any ethics involved. They're just trying to cover their own ass. And you know, it is an office comedy. It is an office comedy at that point, absolutely. Who gets the bigger corner office, you know? And I maybe it's a way to protect myself. You know, I don't know, but it's very I find it very relevant, and I find it all the time, everywhere I go and I look, and maybe not in that magnitude necessarily always, but there is a certain there's certain human qualities or unqualities, if you like, that we just have, and I include myself in that, you know. But and out of a self-protective move, maybe I have to use. I have to use comedy. I also I love the picaresque novels. I'm a big fan of Spanish cinema as well, and I find that you know, cinemas that had to function and criticize a regime, you know, by circumventing censorship, have employed to great, you know, success comedy and farce and the grotesque. Berlanga, Buñuel, you know, all those people really made films that criticized the dominant ideology, but they made it in a way where the dominant ideology just didn't quite get it, that they were the target. And I like that a lot. And I like the picaresque because it comes to human nature not from a moralist's point of view, which I deeply distrust, but from a non-judgmental point of view that allows you to understand the absurdity of life and the absurdity of existence and the absurdity of cultural specificities, and makes you ask questions that pertain to your own life. You know, I don't think there's much value in condemning, from a moral point of view, other people. I'm very mistrustful of that. It was intentional, absolutely. There are only two films told from the perspective of the perpetrator in German cinema, which is the Wannsee Conference and which is about a German life, both of which are, of course, the first row of perpetrators. I didn't want to make a film about the first row, but I wanted to make a film that sort of takes a look at the dynamic structure of National Socialism. And I felt that you needed to tell that story from the perspective of the perpetrators to really understand the system and how it works. We have a tremendous amount of conventions in Germany when it comes to films that deal with World War II. And you know, I could run down a catalog right now, but that would go beyond our abilities, right, time-wise. But I consciously did not want to adhere to these conventions. What I was not entirely prepared for was to find out that these conventions had somehow hardened into truth. They had calcified into rules that one needs to abide by. If you break the rules, it is not perceived by some as a breaking of the rules or a subversion of the rules, but as a mistake, as if I didn't know how to make the film the proper way. And so in hindsight, I'm even more happy that I made this film, because I think it was a necessary taboo to break. There's still national myths in Germany that we have that pertain to World War II that we haven't dealt with, that the film also looks at, and we had a lot of opposition. You know, a lot of, as I said earlier, there were also people who felt that the film soiled the German Wehrmacht, and I think the Wehrmacht has done just fine by themselves, soiling themselves. They don't need me for that. So. But such is the attitude, and I think that cinema is so many things. Cinema can be so many things. You know, sometimes I think surveillance footage could be cinema. You know, presented in a certain way, and to stop exploring the possibilities of how to tell stories, sort of flies in the face, I think, of what cinema is, because cinema has to renew itself. You know, there are always these things that pop up, and then the second person who does it does a variation, and then the third person already turns it into a cliche. So we have to continuously evolve, and I think we're right now, the evolution right now is limited I feel, to visual effects. The innovation in cinema right now is no longer an innovation of narrative techniques. It is an innovation in terms of world building, which is fine, but now we've started to mistake one for the other, and that's not good for cinema, to say the least. So making a film outside of the system, like The Captain was, yes, it was absolutely important to me to not repeat a certain kind of approach, to find my own way. It was also like a little bit like you would approach a sculpture. You know, you have a big block of rock, and you kind of, okay, I don't want this piece, and you get away with it. And slowly you can't make a film just out of negation alone, right? You have to, at a certain point, find what you think you need to do. But I definitely started from a point of exclusion. You know, I didn't want the good Nazi. I didn't want this. I didn't want the film to pretend. You know, I didn't want the film to fall prey to the kind of fetishism of authenticity, which is practiced in Germany. They think if you get the number decal right, you get the time right. If you get, you know, and also sort of to separate the past from the present is one of the conventions. To present the past as a finite construct. Yeah, and I just don't understand why you would even make a historical narrative unless it was immediately applicable and relevant to present day. There are other film cultures that have dealt with World War II in a different fashion, cultures that were also involved, but who have sort of, you know, went through a sort of cinematic autodafé. You know, and exercised a lot of this stuff that I think we're still struggling with. I mean, there's no such thing as la comme Lucien, for example, in German cinema. There's no Kurohara in German cinema, and all these filmmakers or Munch or all these filmmakers took a good hard look at the human condition in times of war, and at the culpability of the individual. And German cinema has shied away from that. Well, I think there's comic book violence, you know, where there's no blood and it's green ooze coming out, and I think that's its own thing. I think the question should pertain more to a kind of exploitative and quote unquote realistic depiction of violence and an inhuman depiction of violence. And I find it always interesting still that in America the most vile violence gets a pass, but if you have full frontal nudity, everybody's in an uproar. In Europe, it's the exact same. It's the exact opposite from that. You know, we have full frontal nudity at 6 in the afternoon. 6, you know, but when you show, you know, a character mowing down, you know, extras and then stepping on their bodies, that'll get you bumped. So I don't think that. I think when you film a real occurrence, you have a responsibility to the victims, and you have a responsibility to yourself as well to not become morally reprehensible. However, there are different ways of doing it. Andrzej Wajda did Katyn, and he showed the massacre in great detail. He showed every bullet hit. The entire ending is the massacre, and for him, of course, it was an exorcism because that's where his father was killed. So the question, you know, how does a historical occurrence, you know, affect the way you approach your depiction of violence? It is such a big question to me. You know, I think you again, you look back and you see your own response, visceral or otherwise, to certain depictions of violence, and I didn't want it to feel visceral. I didn't want it to feel dramatically exploitative. And for my money, it isn't, because it takes a step back and lets it play out. And the German word is Ablauf, as just something, as a mechanical almost process. And that's what it really was. It was a well-oiled, fine-tuned machine to kill. And that's, could you show less? Of course, but I think at a certain point you also betray the victims, and that's the balance you have to find. You have to, not betray the pain of the victims and how they really died, and make that too easy for the audience. But at the same time, I think you can't use it in a traditional narrative dramatic way. I don't know. It's a tough one. I mean, we tried it. What we did to some already seems like pornography. To some it wasn't enough. It's like everybody comes to it with such a bias. I can only speak for myself, where I was trying to get away with the horror of it without being exploitative.